There are moments when awareness opens without asking anything from you. Not a question, not a demand, not even a direction. Just a slight widening inside, barely noticeable, as if something small is present, but not trying to be seen. This is not the feeling itself. It is the condition around it. Something exists in that space that never needed to announce itself. Not because it was hidden, and not because it was waiting. It simply did not arrive at a moment where attention was available. It did not cross into recognition. It stayed smaller than notice. You can sense that now, not as a discovery, but as a quiet mismatch. What was lived did not fully register. What passed through did not become an inner event. And yet nothing about it feels wrong. It feels unfinished, only in the loosest sense, like a sentence that never needed to be completed. Awareness rests here without urgency. There is no search happening, no attempt to locate what was missed. Instead, there is a subtle recognition that not everything that matters becomes clear at the time it happens. Some things remain beneath the threshold simply because the threshold was occupied. Attention was elsewhere, not distracted, not overwhelmed, just already full. In this space, the idea of time feels different. Time is not something that moved too fast or slowed too late. It feels more like a gate that sometimes never opens, not out of refusal, but out of circumstance. Certain inner signals arrive without finding an entrance. They do not wait. They do not return. They simply remain as unregistered presence. That presence does not push. It does not linger loudly. It does not ask to be interpreted. It exists as something smaller than emotion, smaller than memory. A faint internal trace that never became an object of awareness. And now, noticing that fact does not turn it into one. Awareness holds this gently, without trying to give it shape. There is a quiet distinction forming here, not stated, not emphasized. Intensity was never the requirement. Volume was never the qualifier. Something does not need to be strong to be meaningful, and it does not need to be meaningful to exist. The absence of attention did not erase it. It only left it without a place. This is not regret. It is not reflection. It is not insight arriving late. It is simply the noticing that some inner movements never rise high enough to be met. They pass through a life that is already in motion, and they remain as faint impressions rather than experiences. The mind stays wide with this. It does not narrow into analysis. It does not ask what it should have done differently. There is no comparison between then and now. Only the recognition that awareness itself has limits even in its quietest states. In that recognition, something softens not as relief, but as allowance. You can sense how easily attention prioritizes what demands it, how naturally it moves toward what interrupts, and how many small inner signals never interrupt at all. They do not compete. They do not announce urgency. They remain subtle enough to be overlooked without being denied. Here, awareness does not try to correct that pattern. It simply observes it. There is no attempt to reclaim what was missed, no effort to reconstruct a moment that never formed. The noticing stays with the fact that something can exist without ever becoming a moment. That fact settles lightly. It becomes clear, without explanation, that unfelt is not the same as ignored. Ignoring implies a choice. This was not a choice. It was a condition. Attention moved forward, and something did not move with it. Awareness holds that difference without framing it as loss. The internal space remains open, but not expectant. Nothing is being invited in. Nothing is being kept out. There is simply room for the idea that experience does not always convert into awareness at the same rate it occurs. And in that room, the smallest feelings, those that never had time, are not summoned. They are not retrieved. They are not named. They are acknowledged only as possibility. A quiet understanding emerges without turning into clarity. Some things are lived without being met. That does not make them unfinished stories or hidden truths. It makes them small presences that pass through without leaving a mark strong enough to notice. Awareness does not try to elevate them now. It does not give them weight retroactively. It does not insist they mattered more than they did. It allows them to remain exactly what they were, small, brief, unregistered. And in allowing that awareness itself, relaxes its demand to account for everything. Nothing needs to become clearer here. Nothing needs to become meaningful. The inner space stays neutral, steady, unpressured. It does not move toward explanation or closure. It rests in the simple state of noticing that not every feeling is meant to be felt at the time it appears. Some pass quietly. Some never arrive fully. Some remain as traces without becoming experiences. Awareness stays with that truth without naming it as such. There is a subtle sense of something that never quite happened. Not something lost, not something taken away, just a moment that was never available to begin with. It does not appear as absence. It appears as a quiet blank where nothing was ever placed. Awareness moves slowly around that blank without trying to fill it. There is no impulse to reconstruct what might have been there. No attempt to imagine an alternate version where the moment arrived on time. The mind simply notices that certain inner signals require a window, and that window was not open. This feels different from forgetting. Forgetting implies that something was once held. This was never held. It did not slip away. It never crossed into contact. What remains is a faint impression of almost without the tension that usually follows that word. Almost does not turn into longing here. It does not create pressure. It exists as a neutral observation. There was no usable moment. Awareness touches the edge of that realization gently. A feeling can exist and still never find a point of entry. Not because it was blocked, not because it was refused, simply because attention was already committed elsewhere, already occupied, already moving. There is no conflict in that, no sense of wrongdoing. The mind recognizes how easily it assumes that if something mattered, it would have been noticed. And yet, here is evidence to the contrary, quiet, unemphatic, unarguable. Something mattered just enough to exist, but not enough to interrupt. That realization does not arrive as insight. It arrives as a soft internal shift, barely noticeable, like a slight change in balance that does not require adjustment. Awareness stays with the feeling of a missing moment without turning it into a problem. There is no urgency to resolve it, no impulse to give it shape. The feeling that never arrived does not ask to be recovered. It does not behave like something waiting to be felt later. It behaves more like a trace that never consolidated complete in its incompleteness. This distinction matters quietly. Unfelt does not mean delayed. Unfelt does not mean hidden. Unfelt does not imply return. It simply means there was no meeting point. Awareness allows that to settle without commentary. There is a brief sense of touching the edge of something internal an emotional response that never became one. It does not carry weight. It does not carry meaning. It carries only the fact of its near existence, and that fact does not demand elaboration. The mind notices how often it equates awareness with presence, as if being aware is what grants something legitimacy. Here, that assumption loosens slightly. Something does not need to be aware of itself to exist. It can pass through without leaving an identifiable trace and still have been there. This is not a comforting thought. It is not unsettling either. It is neutral. Awareness lingers here, not examining, not questioning, just staying close enough to notice the shape of non-arrival. There's no emotional charge attached to this, no sense of loss, no sense of relief. The absence of a moment is simply acknowledged as part of how attention operates. Sometimes attention is available. Sometimes it is not. Nothing more is added to that. A small internal pause forms not to wait for something, but to recognize that waiting was never part of this. The pause does not complete anything. It simply creates space around the idea that a feeling can exist without ever becoming timely. The mind briefly brushes against the difference between what happened and what was met. That difference does not widen into analysis. It stays narrow, manageable, almost abstract. Awareness remains open, but not inviting. There's no expectation that something will emerge from this, no anticipation of clarity. The state is one of quiet acknowledgement, not discovery. A missing moment does not have edges. It does not have boundaries. It cannot be revisited. And because of that, there's nothing to return to. The mind stops trying to locate where the moment would have fit. That question dissolves on its own. The concept of the right time loses relevance here. There was no right time. There was simply no time. That realization does not feel heavy. It feels factual in the softest sense, accepted without argument. Awareness notices that it often treats moments as containers, as if feelings arrive and wait to be placed inside them. Here, that structure loosens. A feeling does not wait. It either meets attention or it does not. This one did not. There is no judgment attached to that, no correction implied. Just a quiet understanding of how easily experience and awareness move at different speeds. The mind allows itself to stay with that difference without bridging it. There's a calmness in not trying to repair the gap, not trying to retrieve what never formed. The internal space remains steady, not as a state, but as a condition. Nothing needs to be done with this recognition. The sense of a missing moment stays faint peripheral. It does not pull focus. It does not compete with other inner signals. It simply exists as a soft marker, something passed without entry. Awareness does not elevate it now. It does not assign significance retroactively. It does not insist that it should have mattered more. It remains exactly what it was, a near feeling, a non-event, a moment that never arrived. And awareness, in staying with that, does not become clearer or wiser. It simply becomes a little more tolerant of the fact that not everything that passes through experience becomes part of inner history. Some things do not register. Some moments never form. Some feelings exist only at the edge of awareness without crossing in. The mind rests with that without concluding anything from it. The internal space stays open but quiet, not expectant, not empty, just available enough to hold the idea that awareness itself has limits, and that those limits are not failures. They are conditions. There is a quiet recognition that attention is never unlimited, not as a complaint, not as a constraint to be solved, simply as a condition that exists, whether it is acknowledged or not. Within that condition, something small begins to take shape, not as a feeling that demands recognition, but as an awareness of how inner space is distributed. Some things are noticed immediately. Some things are noticed later. And some things never receive enough allocation to become noticeable at all. This is not because they were pushed aside. It is because there was no room assigned. Awareness rests with that idea gently. It does not turn it into explanation. It does not frame it as cause and effect. It simply allows the sense of limited inner capacity to exist without judgment. There is a faint understanding here. Attention behaves like a quiet budget, even when nothing feels urgent. It moves toward what already has presence. It invests where there is signal. And it leaves the smallest signals untouched, not out of neglect, but out of proportion. A feeling can be present and still never receive funding. That realization does not arrive with weight. It does not carry disappointment. It feels almost administrative in nature, though not in language, more like a neutral accounting that does not require correction. Awareness notices how often it assumes that noticing is automatic, that if something exists internally, it will eventually surface. Here, that assumption loosens. Something can exist indefinitely, without surfacing, simply because it never crossed the threshold of allocation. The mind does not resist this. It does not argue. Instead, it observes how many subtle signals pass through without ever becoming inner objects. They remain as faint movements rather than experiences. Not denied, not suppressed, simply unfunded. There's no blame attached to that word, no moral edge. Allocation is not a choice here. It is a condition shaped by what already occupies awareness. When something louder or more structured is present, quieter signals remain unassigned. This recognition stays abstract. It does not attach itself to a story or a moment. It remains general, diffuse, non-specific. Awareness notices a slight discomfort in admitting this, not because it feels wrong, but because it challenges the idea that inner life is fully accessible. That discomfort does not expand. It stays mild, almost informational. The internal system feels full, even when nothing feels intense. There is a density to awareness that has nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with capacity. Thoughts, impressions, minor tasks of noticing these take up space, quietly leaving little room for the smallest feelings to form. That is not a flaw. It is simply how attention organizes itself. A small feeling is sensed here, not as an emotion, but as the idea of one that never reached formation. It existed long enough to leave a trace, but not long enough to be registered. Awareness holds that trace without trying to amplify it. There's a moment where the mind almost turns this into a theme, almost labels it as something important. But that movement softens before it completes. The trace remains small, and awareness allows it to stay that way. Not everything needs to be expanded to justify its presence. There is a quiet shift here, the understanding that some things do not disappear because they are weak, but because they are subtle. They are not overtaken. They are simply never prioritized. This shift does not feel like realization. It feels like recalibration. The mind stops assuming that every inner signal wants to be heard. Some signals exist without intention. They do not ask for recognition. They do not wait patiently. They simply occur within conditions that may or may not allow for noticing. Awareness stays with the neutrality of that. A mild tension appears, not emotional, not cognitive, more like the friction of recognizing a limit without wanting to transcend it. The mind senses that there is nothing to fix here, no better allocation strategy, no need to rearrange attention retroactively. The small feeling that never received allocation is not waiting now. It is not delayed. It is not returning. It simply exists as evidence that not all experience becomes inner narrative. That evidence does not demand response. Awareness notices how easily it confuses significance with visibility. If something mattered, it assumes it would have been noticed. Here, that equation loosens. Matter does not guarantee visibility. Presence does not guarantee allocation. This does not diminish the inner life. It makes it more accurate. The mind allows this to be true without expanding it into conclusion. It does not try to derive meaning. It does not attempt to generalize beyond this moment of noticing. There is a quiet humility in this state, not named, not highlighted. Just the soft acceptance that awareness is selective by nature, even when it feels open. A feeling that never received allocation does not become a loss. It does not become unfinished business. It does not become a missing piece. It remains what it always was, a small internal signal that passed through without being met. Awareness does not chase it now. It does not try to make up for missed attention. It does not reassign resources retroactively. There is a subtle relief in that restraint. Not relief as comfort, but relief as release from the expectation that everything must be accounted for. The mind remains with the idea that experience can be larger than awareness without being problematic. That there can be more happening internally than what becomes noticeable, and that this surplus does not need to be managed. This state holds steady without turning into steadiness as a theme. Nothing resolves here. Nothing closes. Awareness simply stays present with the understanding that attention has limits, and within those limits, some feelings remain unfunded, not ignored, not delayed, just never allocated. That understanding settles quietly, without becoming a takeaway. There is a sense that interruption does not always arrive as an event. Sometimes it is simply the condition under which attention operates, not something sudden, not something disruptive, just a continuous state where inner space is already occupied. Awareness rests with that idea without naming it as a problem. It notices how often attention is already engaged before a feeling has a chance to take shape. Not pulled away, not forced elsewhere, just already in use. In that condition, something small tries to form. It does not announce itself. It does not rise. It does not ask. It begins to gather and then disperses, not because it was rejected, but because there was no opening long enough for it to consolidate. This does not feel dramatic. It feels procedural. Awareness senses a pattern that does not belong to any single moment. A quiet dominance of interruption, not by noise or urgency, but by continuity. Attention moves from one inner task to another without pause, and the smallest signals never gain enough presence to interrupt that movement. There is no single interrupter to point to, no cause to isolate. The interruption is ambient. It is simply how awareness flows. A feeling arrives and finds the channel occupied. It does not wait. It does not push. It dissolves before it can become anything recognizable. Awareness stays with that without turning it into loss. The absence of a formed feeling becomes its own texture, not emptiness, not void, but a thin layer where something almost happened. That thinness does not demand filling. It does not feel incomplete in the way stories do. It feels unfinished only in the loosest sense, like a shape that never fully outlined itself. Awareness notices how easily it assumes that if something matters, it will interrupt. That importance announces itself through urgency or weight. Here, that assumption softens. Some things matter quietly, and quiet things do not interrupt. They pass beneath the threshold of interruption and leave no signal strong enough to pause awareness. This does not feel unfair. It does not feel wrong. It feels like a neutral description of how attention distributes itself when it is continuously engaged. There's a faint recognition that interruption dominance does not require speed. It does not require pressure. It can exist even in low arousal states. Awareness can be calm and still unavailable, open and still occupied. This recognition stays subtle. It does not turn into insight. It does not lead to adjustment. Awareness observes how it moves forward without checking whether something was left behind, not because it avoids checking, but because checking itself would require interruption, and interruption is already dominated. A small feeling begins to form again briefly. It has no content, no direction. It is sensed only as the possibility of an inner response. And then it fades, leaving behind nothing but the awareness that it almost existed. That awareness does not linger on the almost. There is no attempt to capture it this time. No desire to slow things down to make space. The noticing remains passive observational. Awareness recognizes that some things do not return, not because they were suppressed and not because they were deferred. They do not return because they never arrived fully enough to have a trajectory. This is not framed as final. It is framed as factual. The mind notices a subtle shift in how unfinishedness feels here. It is not tension. It is not expectation. It is simply a state where nothing requires completion. The absence of a moment does not create a pull backward. There is no sense that something needs to be revisited. The internal space does not turn reflective. It remains oriented forward, but without urgency. Awareness allows the idea that interruption can be gentle and constant at the same time. That attention can be perpetually engaged without ever being overwhelmed. And that within that engagement, the smallest inner movements may never find room to surface. This allowance does not lead to resignation. It leads to neutrality. A quiet observation settles in some feelings are not missed because they were important, but because they were too small to interrupt what was already in motion. That statement does not harden into belief. It remains flexible, unasserted. Awareness does not attach emotion to this. There is no sadness rising from it. No relief either. The tone remains even low contrast. The internal system feels how easily it moves past these micro attempts at formation without marking them. And that ease does not feel careless. It feels efficient in the most neutral sense. A faint sense of unfinishedness appears again, not attached to any content, not asking for completion. It is simply the recognition that not everything that begins is meant to continue. That recognition does not become wisdom. It becomes background understanding. Awareness notices that the idea of a moment itself may be overstated, as if inner life were meant to organize itself into clear points of contact. Here, that expectation loosens. Some things are too diffuse to become moments. They exist only as brief internal alignments that dissolve immediately. Interruption dominance makes room only for what can assert itself. The smallest feelings do not assert. They do not interrupt. They remain ephemeral. Awareness stays with this without assigning meaning. It does not try to correct the imbalance. It does not imagine a different configuration where every feeling is met. It accepts that this configuration exists. The internal tone remains steady without becoming steadiness as an identity. It does not settle into calm. It does not move toward rest. It simply continues. The feeling that never formed is not reclaimed. It is not reintroduced. It remains a non-event, and awareness does not try to elevate it beyond that. There's a quiet trust here, not in process, not in outcome, but in the idea that awareness does not need to account for everything that passes through it. Some things pass through unmarked. Some beginnings never gather. Some signals remain too small to interrupt. Awareness allows that to be true without closing around it. Nothing resolves. Nothing concludes. The internal space stays open, occupied, and quietly unavailable without conflict. There is something that remains without ever having been formed. Not a memory, not a feeling that faded, not an impression that returned later. It exists as a trace without a container. Awareness approaches this carefully, not because it is fragile, but because there is nothing solid to approach. The trace does not present itself as content. It does not carry a story or a message. It appears only as a sense that something passed through without leaving a mark strong enough to be noticed at the time. This is not absence. It is not presence either. It is a residue of something that never consolidated into experience. Awareness does not try to give it shape. The moment that would have shaped it never existed, and without that moment, there is nothing to reconstruct. The trace does not ask to be understood. It does not hint at meaning. It simply exists as an unregistered remainder. There is a quiet difference here between what is remembered and what is traced. Memory implies form. Trace implies contact without capture, something brushed against awareness without ever becoming part of it. That brushing did not register. It did not linger. It did not announce itself. And yet, its absence now is not empty. Awareness stays with this without framing it as something missing. There is no sense that something should have been there instead. The trace is not a whole. It is a faint outline of a presence that never became defined. This is not something that returns. It is not something that waits. It exists only as the fact that not everything that touches awareness becomes recognizable. The mind notices how easily it tends to require narrative in order to acknowledge experience. Something must have a shape, a name, a sequence. Here none of that applies. The trace has no narrative attached to it, and awareness does not try to invent one. There is no effort to remember. There is no effort to feel. The trace is held without pressure. It becomes apparent that some inner signals leave behind only this kind of remainder, something too subtle to be remembered, too brief to be processed, too quiet to interrupt. They do not become unresolved issues or unfinished emotions. They simply pass through and leave a thin afterpresence. Awareness does not attempt to thicken that presence. There is a moment where the mind almost asks, was there something there? But the question dissolves before it completes. The trace does not confirm or deny. It does not answer. It remains unresponsive to inquiry. And that feels appropriate. Awareness begins to sense that the need to label something as nothing or something is misplaced here. The trace exists outside that distinction. It is not nothing because there is awareness of it. It is not something because there is no content to hold. It is simply a subtle remainder. This remainder does not accumulate emotion around it. There is no frustration, no curiosity, no pull toward understanding. It is noticed, and then awareness stays with the noticing rather than the thing noticed. That shift matters quietly. Awareness stops trying to validate the trace. It does not need to prove that something occurred. It does not need to confirm that a feeling existed. The trace does not become more real through attention. It remains light. There is a gentle tolerance developing here, not framed as acceptance, not framed as insight. Just a widening capacity to allow experience that does not register clearly. Awareness does not insist that everything be identifiable. The trace exists without needing permission. There is a faint sense that if awareness were more focused, more available, this trace might have become something else. But that thought does not lead anywhere. It does not turn into regret. It does not suggest correction. The trace is not a missed opportunity. It is a different category of experience altogether. Awareness recognizes that some things leave behind only this, a quiet suggestion that something happened internally without ever becoming distinct enough to remember. This recognition does not sharpen. It stays soft. The mind does not reach for explanation. It does not look for causes or conditions. It does not connect the trace to any particular moment. The trace remains detached from time. There is no then associated with it. There is no now either. It exists in a neutral inner space where temporal distinctions do not apply. Awareness rests here without effort. It does not hold on to the trace. It does not try to sustain it. The trace does not require maintenance. It is present only as long as awareness notices that it is present. That noticing does not deepen it. It does not clarify it. It does not transform it. It simply acknowledges that some inner experiences leave behind nothing more than this faint remainder. The mind senses a quiet permission in that. Permission to allow experience to be incomplete without turning it into a problem. Permission to let subtlety remain subtle. This does not lead to relief or comfort. It leads to neutrality. Awareness becomes less invested in whether something counts as an experience. The trace is allowed to exist without being counted. There is a subtle easing here, not of emotion, but of expectation. The expectation that inner life must be fully accessible loosens slightly. Awareness does not need to track everything that passes through it. Some things leave no record. Some things leave only a trace. Some things leave neither. Awareness stays open to that reality without turning it into a conclusion. The trace does not fade. It does not grow. It remains exactly as it is, barely there, but not absent. And awareness, in staying with that, does not move toward closure. It does not resolve the experience. It does not summarize it. It simply allows the unregistered to remain unregistered without elevating it, without dismissing it. The internal space remains quiet, low pressure, and unmarked by explanation. Nothing is finished here. Nothing is decided. There is only the gentle recognition that some inner movements leave behind traces rather than experiences, and that this too belongs to awareness. There is a category of inner movement that never becomes emotion, not because it was stopped, not because it was denied. It simply never crossed the threshold where language or recognition would gather around it. Awareness stays with this distinction quietly. It does not try to define where that threshold is. It only notices that something can move internally without ever consolidating into what would normally be called a feeling. This movement is delicate. It does not carry a tone strong enough to announce itself. It does not ask to be named. It exists as a faint internal shift, so slight that it can be mistaken for nothing at all. Awareness does not correct that mistake. It observes it. There is a tendency within the mind to recognize only what becomes clear enough to label. If it cannot be pointed to, it is often assumed not to exist. Here, that assumption loosens. Something exists without becoming identifiable. The micro-feeling does not develop. It does not intensify. It does not stabilize. It appears briefly as a subtle change in inner balance and then returns to indistinction. Awareness notices how easily it would have missed this entirely. How natural it is to pass over movements that do not insist on being felt. This noticing does not produce effort. It does not create a desire to become more attentive. It simply remains present with the fact. There is no disappointment here, no sense of loss. The micro-feeling is not something that failed to become emotion. It was never trying to. It belongs to a different scale of inner life, one that does not translate into recognizable states. Awareness holds this gently, without turning it into insight. There is a quiet recognition that emotion, as it is usually understood, requires a certain consolidation. It needs density. It needs duration. It needs enough internal agreement to form a shape. These micro-feelings never reach that agreement. They dissolve before alignment occurs. This is not resistance. It is not avoidance. It is simply the nature of subtle internal movement. Awareness senses how often it relies on summaries to make sense of inner experience. Something is felt, and then it is named. Something is named, and then it is remembered. Here, that chain never completes. The micro-feeling bypasses the entire sequence. It does not become part of inner history. There is a faint internal pause as awareness recognizes this, not a pause to capture the feeling, but a pause to allow the idea that not everything needs to become something. The micro-feeling does not ask for validation. It does not seek recognition. It exists as a momentary adjustment in inner tone, too small to register as emotion, too brief to accumulate meaning. Awareness does not attempt to amplify it. It does not slow things down to hold on to it. There is no sense that this movement deserves more attention than it received. The mind notices a subtle habit, the habit of equating significance with intensity. If something is intense, it must matter. If it matters, it must be felt. Here, that habit loosens slightly. Something can matter enough to exist and still never become intense enough to be felt. This does not feel comforting. It does not feel unsettling. It feels accurate. Awareness remains with the micro-feeling as it passes without turning it into a reference point. There is no comparison between this movement and others. No ranking, no evaluation. The internal voice stays quiet. There's a sense of incompleteness here, but it is not experienced as lack. It is experienced as openness. The micro-feeling does not complete itself into emotion, and awareness does not require it to. The urge to summarize fades. The urge to interpret does not arise. Awareness becomes tolerant of signals that never consolidate. This tolerance does not appear as patience. It appears as absence of demand. There is a subtle understanding that inner life is layered and that some layers are too thin to support structure. They move, they shift, and they dissolve without leaving residue. The micro-feeling leaves no trace, no memory, no after effect. And yet awareness does not treat it as irrelevant. It is acknowledged simply as movement. There is a moment where the mind almost asks whether something like this should be attended to more carefully. That question does not complete. It dissolves before it forms an argument. Awareness remains neutral. The micro-feeling does not return. It does not repeat. It does not ask for another chance. It existed briefly and then was gone. This does not register as disappearance. It registers as completion at its own scale. Awareness allows that scale to exist without comparison. There is a quiet release here, not of emotion, but of the expectation that inner movement must culminate in recognizable feeling. The mind stops insisting that every internal signal should arrive at the same destination. Some arrive nowhere. Some arrive briefly. Some never arrive at all. Awareness does not elevate this understanding into principle. It remains local, specific, unasserted. The internal space feels slightly wider, not because something expanded, but because something was not required to condense. The micro-feeling passed through without being asked to become more than it was. That passing does not create emptiness. It creates continuity. Awareness remains steady without becoming steadiness. It does not hold on to the micro-feeling as an example. It does not reference it again. The recognition that some inner movements do not become emotion stays faint, almost backgrounded. It does not pull focus. It does not demand reflection. It simply exists as a quiet allowance. Allowance for subtlety. Allowance for incompletion. Allowance for internal movement that never needs to be named. Awareness does not try to remember this later. It does not store it as insight. It does not transform it into understanding. It remains what it is, a brief noticing that some feelings never become feelings, and that this is not a failure of awareness, but a characteristic of how inner life moves. The micro-feeling has already passed. Awareness does not follow it. Nothing resolves here. Nothing concludes. The internal space stays quiet, open, and unmarked by explanation. There is a quiet sense that something was lost without ever being taken. Not because it was dropped, not because it was rushed past, but because attention moved in a way that left no room for it. This is not about speed as a bodily state. It is about speed as an internal condition, how quickly attention assigns priority without announcing that it is doing so. Awareness stays with this carefully. It does not frame it as pressure. It does not describe it as urgency. It simply notices that attention often moves forward, by default selecting what can hold it and leaving the smallest signals unassigned. A small feeling appears within that condition. It does not arrive loudly enough to pause attention. It does not compete. It does not insist. It registers only as a slight inner shift, too faint to be held, too brief to form. Awareness does not try to slow things down to meet it. There is no attempt to create space retroactively. The noticing remains observational, not corrective. There's a quiet recognition here. Attention moves first. Feeling follows only if it can keep up. This recognition does not sharpen into critique. It does not become dissatisfaction. It remains neutral, descriptive. Awareness senses how easily it labels these moments as nothing happened, not because nothing occurred, but because nothing completed. The small feeling did not arrive fast enough to be acknowledged before attention moved on. That does not register as loss. It registers as omission. The difference is subtle but important. Loss implies removal. Omission implies absence of allocation. Awareness holds that distinction without turning it into principle. A faint emotional tone appears here, something like sadness, but too quiet to claim that name. It does not rise. It does not settle. It exists only as a soft internal dip that never becomes expressive. Awareness does not ask it to speak. It does not try to understand it. The tone remains low signal, unperformed. There is a gentle awareness of how often attention rewards what arrives quickly, what asserts itself, what organizes itself into something recognizable. The smallest feelings do none of these things. They appear without structure, without urgency, without a claim. And so they pass. Awareness does not treat this as unfair. It treats it as a condition of how noticing operates. There is a moment where the mind almost frames this as something that could be changed, almost imagines a different way of attending that would catch everything. That thought does not complete. It dissolves quietly, leaving behind no sense of correction needed. Awareness remains with what is. The small feeling that never registered does not ask to be revisited. It does not ask to be amplified now. It does not return as unfinished business. It remains exactly where it was unmet, but not unresolved. That distinction matters quietly. Unresolved implies tension. Unmet implies timing. Awareness notices that timing, not intensity, often determines what becomes felt. And timing here is not measured in moments or duration. It is measured in availability. Attention was not available. This does not feel like a failure. It feels like a fact. A subtle sense of internal weight appears not heavy enough to be called heaviness. It does not press. It does not linger. It is felt only as a brief awareness that something passed without contact. Awareness allows that weight to remain unexpressed. There's no attempt to convert it into emotion or meaning. It stays low quiet, almost invisible. There is a faint relief in not having to elevate it, not having to justify its presence by making it stronger. The mind recognizes how often feelings are required to perform, to rise, to declare themselves, to become clear. These small feelings do not perform. They exist without announcement and disappear without trace. Awareness does not ask them to do more. There is a quiet internal permission here, not framed as kindness, not framed as acceptance. Simply the permission for subtlety to remain subtle. Attention continues moving, not rushing, not slowing, just continuing. The small feeling does not keep up. It does not follow. It does not leave a record. Awareness remains with the idea that this is not something to correct, that the inner life is not meant to be fully captured, that some signals are too small to survive the movement of attention. This realization does not feel profound. It feels practical. The internal space does not shift into reflection. It stays present, low arousal, unpressured. There is no attempt to compensate now by noticing more intensely. Awareness does not sharpen itself. It does not widen deliberately. It remains exactly as it is. A quiet sadness flickers again, not enough to claim that word. It does not build. It does not collapse. It exists only as a slight lowering of internal tone that passes without announcement. Awareness allows it to pass without trying to hold it. There is no sense that this sadness needs expression, no sense that it points to anything else. It is simply another example of a feeling that does not rise high enough to be met. And awareness stays with that without judgment. The internal system feels how often it moves past these moments without marking them. And that ease does not feel careless. It feels inherent to how attention organizes itself. Some things are noticed. Some things are missed. Not because of neglect, but because of scale. Awareness remains neutral toward this. The idea that everything should be felt dissolves slightly. The expectation that every inner movement deserves contact loosens. Awareness does not become indifferent. It becomes less demanding. There is a quiet steadiness here, but not as a theme, not as a conclusion, just a condition where nothing needs to be intensified to justify itself. The small feeling remains unfelt. Awareness does not chase it. The internal space stays open, but not waiting. Available, but not inviting. Nothing resolves. Nothing closes. There is only the continued movement of attention and the quiet knowledge that some feelings never keep up, and that this is neither wrong nor tragic. It is simply how inner life passes through awareness. There's a sense of a moment that was never available, not postponed, not delayed, simply absent. Awareness approaches this without trying to locate when that moment should have existed. There is no searching backward, no attempt to reconstruct a point where things could have unfolded differently. The mind recognizes that the idea of a right time does not apply here. The moment was not missed. It was never open. This distinction settles quietly. Awareness notices how often it treats moments as containers, as if feelings arrive and wait to be placed inside them. Here, that structure loosens. A feeling does not wait. It does not hover until attention is ready. It appears only if there is space at the instant it arrives. In this case, there was no space. That realization does not feel heavy. It feels factual in a soft, unassertive way. There is no implication that something should have been done differently. No sense that attention failed in its role. The mind allows the idea that availability is not guaranteed, even in stillness. A small inner signal is sensed again, not as a return, but as a reminder of absence. It does not come with content. It does not carry memory. It appears only as a recognition that there was no opening at the time. Awareness does not attempt to create that opening now. There is a subtle understanding that contact and closure are not the same. Closure implies an ending. Contact implies a meeting. Here, there was no meeting, and so closure has nothing to attach to. This does not produce frustration. It produces clarity of a quiet kind. Awareness rests with the fact that contact can be partial or non-existent without creating unfinishedness. Something can exist without ever being met, and that existence does not require resolution. The internal voice does not narrate this. It does not turn it into explanation. The noticing remains simple. A feeling can be unmet without being incomplete. That thought does not sharpen. It does not become belief. It stays as a passing internal alignment. Awareness senses how easily it might have turned this into a story of delay or waiting. That narrative does not form. The mind does not imagine the feeling as something that will arrive later. It understands quietly that later is not relevant here. What matters is not when. What matters is whether. And in this case, there was no entry. The internal space softens around that without becoming permissive or resigned. It simply allows the absence of entry to be true. Awareness notices how often it confuses missed contact with potential, as if something that was not felt still holds promise of being felt later. Here, that assumption loosens. The feeling that did not meet awareness does not wait. It does not persist. It does not carry forward. It exists only as the fact that there was no meeting. This does not feel like loss. It feels like neutral accounting. Awareness stays with the difference between closure and contact. Closure suggests something ended. Contact suggests something happened. Here, neither occurred, and that feels acceptable. The mind stops trying to identify where the moment would have fit. That question loses relevance. There is no slot to point to, no gap to outline. The absence of a moment does not leave a shape behind. Awareness remains open, but not expectant. There's a faint internal easing in letting go of the need to identify a moment, to say, that was when. Without that marker, the experience remains unanchored, and that unanchored quality does not feel unstable. It feels free of obligation. The internal space does not lean toward explanation. It does not assign cause. It does not trace patterns. It simply allows the understanding that availability is a condition, not a guarantee. This understanding does not travel further than it needs to. It does not generalize. It remains specific to this quiet noticing. A subtle sense of stability forms, not as steadiness, not as grounding. More like the absence of friction around what did not happen. The mind no longer presses against the lack of a moment. There is no attempt to compensate now by offering extra attention. Awareness does not lean in. It does not widen artificially. It stays with what is present without trying to replace what was not. The feeling that never met awareness does not return. It does not linger at the edges. It remains absent in the most literal sense, not hidden, not waiting. Awareness accepts that absence without assigning value to it. There is a quiet recognition that some experiences do not belong to memory or feeling. They belong to the category of unmet. And that category does not require completion. The mind notices how different this feels from unresolvedness. Unresolvedness carries tension. Unmet carries none. It simply indicates that something did not occur. This difference settles gently. Awareness becomes less concerned with tracking inner events. It does not need to account for everything that could have happened. It allows the idea that experience is not obligated to become awareness. Some things pass through without entry. Some moments never exist. Some feelings remain uncontacted. None of this demands repair. The internal space remains steady without being named. It does not drift toward calm. It does not move toward rest. It simply stays available without insisting that something fill that availability. The idea of a moment fades further into irrelevance. Awareness no longer looks for it. It no longer expects it. There is a quiet confidence in this, not confidence as certainty, but confidence as lack of tension. The mind does not strain against what was not available. It rests with the simple fact there was no opening. And that fact does not need to be softened, explained, or resolved. Awareness remains with this condition without forming an ending around it. There is no conclusion to draw, no lesson to extract. The internal space stays open, unpressured, and free of expectation. Nothing settles into place. Nothing completes. The absence of a moment remains exactly that absence without becoming a problem or a theme. Awareness allows it to remain so. There is a way some inner signals register without becoming noticeable, not hidden, not delayed, simply too low in signal to rise above the background of attention. Awareness approaches this gently, without naming it as anything specific. It senses a slight shift so subtle it could easily be mistaken for nothing at all. Not a feeling in the usual sense, more like a change in internal density that never consolidates into form. This kind of signal does not announce itself. It does not interrupt. It does not claim space. It exists only as a near presence hovering just below the threshold where attention typically gathers. Awareness stays with this without trying to sharpen it. There is no attempt to listen harder, no effort to increase sensitivity. The noticing remains light, almost casual, as if too much focus would distort what is being sensed. A low signal does not want amplification. It wants permission to remain low. The mind notices how easily it responds to volume. What becomes noticeable is what reaches a certain intensity. What stays subtle is often passed over, not because it lacks importance, but because it lacks force. This realization does not feel corrective. It feels observational. Awareness recognizes that it often waits for signals to become strong enough to justify attention. Here, that habit loosens. Something is allowed to exist without justification. The low signal appears as a slight shift in inner tone, not directional, not expressive. It does not lead anywhere. It does not suggest meaning. It simply alters the internal texture for a brief moment, and then it stays, not growing, not fading, just remaining faint. Awareness does not rush to interpret this. It does not ask what the signal represents. It does not try to connect it to anything else. The noticing remains local, contained, unambitious. There is a subtle curiosity here, but it is not active. It does not reach outward. It simply stays present with the fact that something is being sensed without becoming clear. The mind notices how often it requires clarity to continue attending. When something does not clarify, attention tends to move on. Here, awareness resists that reflex, not by holding tighter, but by allowing ambiguity to remain. The low signal does not become a message. It does not become an emotion. It does not become a thought. It stays exactly where it is, at the edge of awareness, without crossing in. Awareness remains with that edge, without trying to cross it. There's a faint recognition that this kind of signal is often mistaken for absence. Because it does not declare itself, it is assumed not to exist. Here, that assumption loosens slightly. Something exists without declaring itself. This does not feel revelatory. It feels practical. The internal space adjusts, subtly making room for signals that do not want to be foregrounded. Awareness does not move them forward. It simply allows them to remain where they are. A gentle tenderness appears here, not framed as warmth or comfort, more like a softness in how attention holds what it notices. The low signal is met without pressure, without demand. That tenderness does not try to elevate the signal. It does not encourage it to speak. It simply acknowledges its presence without asking for more. The mind notices how rare this is, how often subtle signals are either ignored or forced into clarity. Here, neither happens. The signal remains subtle, and awareness remains receptive. There is no sense that this signal needs to be understood. It does not feel incomplete. It feels sufficient in its faintness. Awareness stays with the idea that not everything needs to be loud to be valid, that some inner movements are meant to remain quiet, unmarked low signal. This idea does not become principle. It stays experiential. The low signal does not grow. It does not accumulate. It does not transform. It simply coexists with awareness for a while. The mind notices how easily it could have missed this entirely, how natural it is to move past what does not demand attention. That noticing does not turn into regret. It remains neutral. Awareness does not attempt to catalog this signal. It does not store it as memory. It does not expect it to return. It does not turn it into reference. The signal remains ephemeral. There is a quiet sense of balance here, not because something settled, but because nothing was pushed. The internal space feels even unstrained, free of effort. The low signal remains unmarked, and that becomes acceptable. Awareness recognizes that some inner experiences are not meant to be processed. They are not meant to be resolved or integrated. They exist briefly, quietly, and then pass without leaving structure behind. This recognition does not feel like letting go. It feels like not needing to hold. The low signal begins to thin, not disappearing, not resolving. It simply becomes less noticeable, not because awareness withdraws, but because the signal never intended to last. Awareness does not follow it. It does not try to keep it present. It allows the signal to remain what it was: small, quiet, low signal. There is a subtle acceptance here, not framed as acceptance, just the absence of resistance. Awareness does not resist the signal's faintness, nor does it resist its passing. The internal space remains open, unpressured, non-demanding. No conclusion forms around this experience. There is no summary, no lesson, no insight claimed. The low signal leaves behind no trace, no residue, no after effect. It does not become something to remember. It does not become something to revisit. Awareness remains steady without becoming steadiness. It does not anchor itself to what just occurred. The mind stays available for whatever comes next without expectation. The quiet understanding that some signals remain low and that this is enough stays present for a moment, then softens. It does not insist on being retained. Nothing resolves here. Nothing completes. The internal space stays as it is: quiet, receptive, tolerant of subtlety. Some inner movements do not need to be noticed to have existed. Some signals do not need to be felt to have passed through. Awareness allows that truth to remain without naming it, without closing around it. There's a faint warmth that appears without announcing itself, not arriving as comfort, not settling as reassurance. It does not move in with intention. It does not suggest safety or completion. It simply becomes noticeable as a slight change in inner tone, subtle enough to be overlooked, present enough to register. Awareness meets this warmth carefully, without naming it as anything it is not. It does not frame it as healing. It does not assign it a role. It allows it to exist as a quality rather than an outcome. This warmth does not replace what was unfelt earlier. It does not compensate. It does not resolve. It coexists with incompleteness without attempting to correct it. Awareness stays with that coexistence quietly. There is no movement toward interpretation. no attempt to decide what the warmth means. It is not treated as a signal pointing elsewhere. It is allowed to remain local. The mind notices how easily warmth is usually turned into comfort, how quickly it is asked to justify itself by offering relief. Here, that expectation loosens. Warmth does not need to do anything. It does not need to calm. It does not need to settle anything. It simply exists. There is a subtle sense of being able to stay with what is present without trying to make it easier or lighter. The warmth does not erase the faint incompleteness that came before. It sits alongside it, neither opposing nor fixing it. Awareness does not lean into the warmth. It does not expand it. It does not try to hold on to it. The noticing remains balanced, allowing warmth and absence to share the same space. This creates a quiet internal contrast, not sharp enough to be called tension. More like two conditions existing simultaneously without needing to interact. The unfelt remains unfelt. The warmth remains gentle. Awareness senses how often it looks for feelings to move in a single direction, toward relief, toward resolution. Here, direction is absent. There is only presence without trajectory. The warmth does not grow. It does not deepen. It does not promise continuation. It remains faint, almost backgrounded, and awareness allows it to stay that way. There is a slight easing in not having to decide what to do with it, not having to turn it into something useful. The internal space becomes less concerned with outcome and more tolerant of coexistence. Warmth without comfort feels different. It feels unfinished in a neutral way. Awareness notices that it can be with this warmth without changing posture internally. There is no leaning forward, no leaning back. The mind stays exactly where it is. This feels important without being emphasized. The warmth does not ask for attention, but it accepts it when it is noticed. It does not compete with other inner signals. It does not override them. Awareness does not treat it as a reward for having stayed present. It does not frame it as progress. It is simply another internal condition that arises without instruction. The mind recognizes that warmth does not always signal closure. It can appear even when nothing has concluded. It can exist alongside open-endedness. This recognition does not turn into insight. It remains experiential. There is a quiet sense of I can be with this that appears without being stated. Not as permission, not as encouragement. More as an absence of resistance. The warmth does not remove the subtle sense of something having been unfelt earlier. It does not overwrite that awareness. It allows both to remain visible. Awareness stays with the fact that not everything needs to move toward clarity or resolution. Some states coexist without merging. The internal voice remains quiet. There is no urge to categorize this warmth as good or necessary. It is not evaluated. It is not compared. It is not prioritized. It simply occupies a small portion of inner space without displacing anything else. The mind notices how rarely it allows this kind of coexistence, how often it expects one state to replace another. Here, replacement does not occur. Warmth does not correct absence. Absence does not diminish warmth. They remain independent. Awareness becomes subtly more spacious, not because something expanded, but because nothing was required to condense. The internal space does not narrow into focus. It stays open, unpressured. The warmth begins to soften further, not fading, not intensifying. It simply becomes less distinct, as if its presence no longer needs to be noted. Awareness does not follow this change. It does not track it. There is no sense of losing something as the warmth becomes less noticeable. It was never held tightly enough to be lost. The internal state remains steady without becoming steadiness as a theme. No lesson forms here. No summary arises. The mind does not turn this into an example of anything larger. It does not generalize. It does not reflect. It simply remains present with the way warmth can appear without comfort and how that is enough. The unfelt from earlier does not return. It does not surface now. It remains as it was unmet, unclaimed. And yet the presence of warmth does not feel like a contradiction. It feels compatible. Awareness allows this compatibility without explanation. There is a quiet sense of continuity here, not because something continues, but because nothing ends. The internal space remains open, available, unmarked by conclusion. Warmth passes through awareness without ceremony. It leaves no instruction behind. It leaves no promise. The mind stays with what remains without needing to define it. Nothing resolves. Nothing closes. There is only the gentle recognition that inner states can overlap without canceling each other, and that warmth does not need to become comfort to belong. Awareness remains where it is quiet, receptive, unpressured. There are feelings that never become events. They do not arrive with edges. They do not gather momentum. They do not cross into the territory where something can be pointed to and named. Awareness notices this without surprise. It does not expect every inner movement to organize itself into an occurrence. Some remain diffuse, unshaped, existing without a moment of arrival. This kind of feeling does not announce itself as absence. It does not signal that something is missing. It simply never asks to be noticed. It does not press forward. It does not request space. It exists quietly, and that quietness does not require justification. Awareness stays with the realization that an inner movement can exist without becoming an event. Not because it was prevented, not because it lacked importance, but because eventness itself requires a certain consolidation that never occurred. This recognition remains soft. It does not turn into explanation. There is a subtle correction happening inside, not articulated, not emphasized. The assumption that something must become noticeable to exist loosens slightly. Awareness allows the possibility that non-event does not equal non-existence. A feeling can remain peripheral without being dismissed. This is not framed as honesty. It is not framed as admission. It is simply allowed to be neutral. Awareness notices how easily it confuses what is not prominent with what is not present. The mind tends to privilege what announces itself. What does not announce itself often goes unmarked. Here that pattern is observed without judgment. The non-event feeling does not ask to be elevated now. It does not seek retroactive recognition. It remains as it was unformed, unrecorded, unclaimed. Awareness does not attempt to move it forward. It does not try to bring it into clarity. It does not search for its shape. There is a sense that if awareness tried to turn this into an event, now it would distort it. It would give it edges it never had. It would impose structure where none existed. So awareness refrains. The non-event feeling is acknowledged only as a category, not as content. It is known by its lack of definition, by its refusal to consolidate. This knowing does not feel analytical. It feels experiential, almost passive. Awareness senses how often it treats eventfulness as a measure of significance. If something happened, it mattered. If nothing happened, nothing mattered. That equation loosens here. Significance does not require eventfulness. Presence does not require a moment. This realization does not produce emotional shift. It remains informational in the quietest sense. The internal space becomes more tolerant of what remains unmarked. Awareness does not try to mark it now. It allows it to remain peripheral without using that as a structure. There is no attempt to move anything from the margins. There is no attempt to highlight. The non-event feeling does not change under observation. It does not become clearer. It does not become more substantial. It remains what it is, something that never rose into form. Awareness does not interpret this as failure. There is a subtle easing here, not as relief, but as release from expectation. The expectation that inner life should be legible softens. Awareness does not need to account for everything that occurs internally. Some things do not present themselves as happenings. Some inner movements never cross into experience as event. Awareness allows that without commentary. The mind notices how rarely it grants this permission, how often it tries to either locate an event or dismiss its absence. Here, neither happens. The non-event feeling remains unclaimed, and that is sufficient. There is a quiet neutrality in this state. No urgency to clarify, no urge to revisit, no need to transform. The non-event feeling does not accumulate weight. It does not linger in a way that demands attention. It remains diffuse, spread thinly across awareness, never concentrating enough to be held. Awareness remains with that diffuseness without trying to condense it. The internal voice stays minimal. It does not narrate. It does not evaluate. It does not summarize. There is a sense that this kind of feeling exists outside the usual inner accounting. It is not something to be processed. It is not something to be remembered. It is simply part of the background movement of inner life, though awareness avoids turning that into a framework. The feeling remains peripheral without being pushed there. It simply never moves inward. Awareness recognizes that this does not require response. There is a faint sense of continuity here, not because something continues, but because nothing breaks. The absence of event does not create rupture. It creates smoothness. Awareness does not attempt to extract meaning from that smoothness. It does not ask what it says about anything. The non-event feeling remains what it always was, something that passed without becoming. There is no attempt to convert this into acceptance, no attempt to turn it into insight. Awareness does not label its own tolerance. It simply remains. The mind notices how often it is drawn to conclusions. Here, conclusion does not form. The experience does not lead anywhere. It does not resolve into understanding. That lack of resolution feels appropriate. Awareness stays with the idea that inner life does not always present itself in discrete units. Some movements are too thin to be events. They exist as part of a larger flow without ever separating from it. This idea does not become a principle. It remains local, quiet, unasserted. The non-event feeling does not fade because it was never present in a way that could fade. It does not disappear. It simply remains unmarked. Awareness does not follow it. It does not track it. It does not try to keep it. There is a subtle trust here, not in process, not in outcome, but in the capacity of awareness to allow what does not announce itself to remain unannounced. Nothing needs to be added to this. Nothing needs to be taken away. The internal space remains open, low pressure, uninterested in final statements. The non-event feeling remains non-eventful, and awareness does not attempt to change that. There is no ending here, no conclusion, only the quiet allowance that some feelings never become events, and that this does not require correction, interpretation, or response. Awareness stays where it is, unhurried, receptive, and uncommitted to marking what does not ask to be marked. There is a subtle thickening that does not lead anywhere, not heaviness, not weight that presses, just a slight increase in inner density that appears without purpose and remains without direction. Awareness notices this change without reacting to it. It does not assume that density must signal importance. It does not assume that something is about to happen. The noticing stays light, observational, uninvested. This density does not announce itself as emotion. It does not gather into a feeling. It does not form an edge. It exists as a condition rather than an experience. Awareness stays with that condition without trying to move through it. There is no impulse to clear it, no urge to understand what caused it. The mind allows the density to exist without framing it as problem or progress. There is a sense that something has become more noticeable, but not more intense. The internal space feels slightly fuller, not because something arrived, but because something became harder to ignore. This does not produce urgency. It does not produce curiosity. It produces presence without agenda. Awareness notices how easily it would have turned this density into meaning, how quickly it might have asked what it represents or where it leads. Here those questions do not arise. The density remains unclaimed by interpretation. It is not treated as a signal. It is not treated as a message. It is simply allowed to be there. The mind recognizes that this kind of density often invites explanation. That impulse softens before it completes. Awareness does not need explanation to stay present. It does not need a reason to tolerate fullness. There is a quiet patience here, not as effort, not as strategy, just the absence of resistance. The density does not deepen. It does not escalate. It does not shift toward clarity. It remains stable in its indistinctness. Awareness stays with the fact that something can become more noticeable without becoming more meaningful. That noticing itself does not require interpretation. The density is experienced as texture rather than content. This texture does not carry emotion. It does not carry thought. It carries only the sense of being there. The internal voice remains minimal. It does not narrate what is happening. It does not comment. It does not frame the experience. Awareness simply remains present with the density as it is. There is a subtle recognition that not every internal change needs to be resolved, that some changes are meant to be experienced without outcome. This recognition does not sharpen into belief. It stays quiet, experiential. The density feels neither welcome nor unwelcome. It does not invite engagement. It does not repel attention. It simply coexists with awareness. There is no attempt to reduce it, no attempt to lean into it. Awareness remains balanced. The mind notices how rarely it allows this, how often it expects density to lead somewhere, to emotion, to insight, to understanding. Here, that expectation loosens. Density does not promise anything. It remains. A faint urge to make sense appears briefly, then dissolves without leaving residue. Awareness does not follow it. The urge passes as quietly as it arose. The internal space does not become clearer. It does not become more focused. It remains dim, even low contrast. The density does not clarify anything about what came before. It does not refer back to the unfelt. It does not bring closure to earlier absence. It simply exists alongside what has already been noticed. Awareness allows this coexistence without linking the two. There is a gentle neutrality in this state. No pressure to move forward, no pull to return. The internal space remains suspended without tension. The density is not treated as something to work through. It is not framed as something to sit with intentionally. Awareness does not take a position toward it. It simply stays. This staying does not feel like waiting. It feels like allowance. The density remains low signal. It does not dominate attention. It does not demand focus. Awareness notices it without centering it. The mind senses how easily this could have been mistaken for nothing, how subtle the difference is between absence and low-density presence. That noticing does not turn into insight. It remains factual. Awareness remains tolerant of this ambiguity. The density does not thicken further. It does not thin out either. It remains steady, without becoming steadiness as a theme. There is no payoff here, no moment of realization. The internal space does not change direction. Awareness does not try to hold on to this experience. It does not store it. It does not mark it as significant. It does not treat it as a step. It remains unmarked. The density slowly becomes less noticeable, not because it resolves, but because awareness does not cling to it. It fades into the background without announcement. Awareness does not follow that change. It does not note when the density becomes less apparent. It simply remains present. There is no sense of something ending, no sense of something beginning. The internal space returns to its prior openness without transition. Awareness recognizes that density can appear and disappear without meaning. That inner life does not always move in arcs or sequences. Some changes are lateral, not directional. This recognition does not become a conclusion. The mind remains quiet, receptive, unpressured. The experience leaves no trace behind. It does not become memory. It does not become reference. It does not influence what comes next. Awareness does not attempt to summarize it. There is a quiet trust here, not in process, not in outcome, but in the ability of awareness to remain with what does not lead anywhere. Nothing is resolved. Nothing is clarified. The internal space stays open, dim, tolerant of density without demanding payoff. Some inner states pass through awareness without leaving structure behind. Some changes register without becoming experiences. Awareness allows this without needing to name it, explain it, or close around it. There is a quality of faintness that does not signal disappearance. It does not mean something is leaving. It does not mean something has ended. It is simply the way certain inner movements remain near the edge of awareness without crossing into it. Awareness notices this faintness without trying to sharpen it. There is no effort to bring it closer, no attempt to hold it still. The noticing stays light, as if too much focus would erase the very thing being noticed. The faintness does not ask for clarity. It does not want to be strengthened. It exists comfortably at the perimeter. Awareness stays with this perimeter without treating it as a boundary to be crossed. It does not imagine that something lies beyond it, waiting to be accessed. The faintness is not a gate. It is simply a mode of presence. There is a subtle internal recognition that awareness often assumes proximity means importance, that what sits closer to the center must matter more. Here that assumption loosens. Something can remain at the edge without being diminished. The faint inner movement is sensed again, not returning, not repeating. It appears as a slight alignment, a brief internal echo without origin. It does not become a thought. It does not become a feeling. It remains an impression without content. Awareness does not try to complete it. There is a moment where attention brushes against it and then moves on, not because it is pulled away, but because there's nothing to hold on to. The faintness offers no surface. It cannot be grasped. This does not feel frustrating. It feels appropriate. Awareness notices how easily it tends to equate contact with capture. To feel something, it believes, is to hold it. Here, that belief softens. Contact can occur without capture. Awareness can brush against something without bringing it in. The faintness remains at the edge, and that edge becomes familiar. Not as a place, not as a state, but as a recurring quality of inner life. Awareness recognizes that much of what happens internally lives here, close enough to be sensed, distant enough to avoid definition. These movements do not want to be centered. They do not ask to be highlighted. They exist in passing. The mind notices how often it treats faintness as a failure of attention, as if something should have been clearer, stronger, more accessible. That framing dissolves here. Faintness is not a deficiency. It is a form. This realization does not become explicit. It remains felt, not stated. Awareness allows the faint inner movement to remain incomplete without labeling it as such. There is no sense of something being unfinished. There is simply no expectation of completion. The faintness does not resolve into clarity. It does not thicken into density. It does not disappear. It stays exactly where it is. Awareness stays with that without commentary. There is a gentle shift here, not toward understanding, but toward tolerance. Tolerance for inner signals that do not organize themselves, that do not arrive with enough definition to be known. This tolerance is not active. It does not require effort. It is simply the absence of resistance. Awareness notices how easily it could have dismissed this faintness as irrelevant. How natural it is to move past what does not assert itself. Here, that movement slows slightly, not to capture the faintness, but to allow it to exist without being dismissed. The faintness remains unclaimed. There is a quiet simplicity in this. No need to decide whether something is important. No need to judge whether it should be attended to more carefully. Awareness does not elevate the faintness by staying with it. It does not make it central. It simply acknowledges its presence without changing its position. The internal space feels lighter here, not because something lifted, but because nothing was required to solidify. Awareness does not demand coherence from what appears. The faint inner movement brushes past again, barely noticeable. It does not repeat itself. It does not accumulate. Each appearance is singular, unconnected to the last. Awareness does not attempt to connect them. There is a sense that this is how many inner experiences occur, brief, peripheral, unrecorded. They do not enter memory. They do not become part of a narrative. They remain as momentary alignments that dissolve without leaving a trace. This understanding does not feel heavy. It feels ordinary. Awareness remains with the ordinary nature of faintness. It does not romanticize it. It does not assign meaning. It does not turn it into depth. It simply allows faintness to be part of awareness without requiring it to become more. The mind notices how often it relies on clarity as a signal to continue attending. Here, clarity never arrives, and attention remains comfortable with that. There is no tension around not knowing, no urge to resolve. The faintness does not ask for resolution. It is complete in its partiality. Awareness senses that this faintness would vanish under scrutiny, that to focus on it too strongly would distort it. And so awareness remains relaxed, allowing the faintness to stay faint. This does not feel like restraint. It feels like alignment. The internal space stays dim, low contrast, receptive. There is no pull toward explanation, no desire to anchor the experience. The faintness gradually becomes less noticeable, not because it leaves, but because awareness does not track it. It fades into the general movement of inner life without announcement. Awareness does not mark this fading. It does not note the transition. There is no sense of loss. The faintness did not belong to awareness long enough to be lost. There is a quiet appreciation here, not framed as appreciation. Just a sense that inner life does not require every movement to be held. Some movements remain peripheral by nature. Some signals stay faint. Some experiences never cross the threshold into awareness as event. Awareness allows this without turning it into belief or conclusion. The internal space remains open, unpressured, uninterested in extracting meaning. Nothing resolves here. Nothing concludes. The faintness remains part of inner life without ever becoming a focal point, and awareness does not try to make it one. It stays at the edge, and that is enough. Awareness lowers without moving toward rest, not settling, not easing. It simply shifts downward as if attention has become less inclined to reach outward, less interested in holding itself upright. There is no intention behind this, no aim to relax. The movement happens quietly, without being initiated. In this lowered state, nothing in particular becomes clearer. There is no sharpening of perception, no unveiling. Awareness does not gather around any single point. It spreads thinly, evenly without focus. This lowering does not feel like descent. It feels like release of altitude. Awareness remains present without maintaining height. It does not hold itself up. It does not scan. It does not search. A small internal signal is sensed again, not as return, not as repetition. It appears only as a familiar faintness near the edge of awareness. It does not move inward. It does not ask to be received. Awareness does not reach for it. There is a softer grip now, not because something was loosened deliberately, but because the grip was never necessary. Attention no longer tries to hold what passes through it. It allows inner movement to occur without containment. This softness does not feel permissive or passive. It feels neutral. The mind notices how often it tries to validate experience by holding it, by keeping it present long enough to be named. Here that effort is absent. Awareness does not insist on recognition. The faint inner movement remains peripheral, unchanged by this softer holding. It does not move closer. It does not recede. It simply exists where it is unclaimed. Awareness allows this without commentary. There is a quiet shift in how presence is felt. It is no longer oriented around being aware of. It becomes simply being. Awareness does not frame itself as an observer. It remains without posture. This change does not feel significant. It feels natural. The internal space feels slightly wider, not because something expanded, but because nothing is being compressed. Attention is not condensed into points. It is spread evenly lightly. The faint inner movement does not benefit from this spread. It does not become clearer. It does not consolidate. And awareness does not expect it to. There is no question of validity here. The faintness is neither affirmed nor dismissed. It simply remains. Awareness notices how rarely it allows this kind of lowered presence, how often it maintains a certain height, a certain readiness to engage. Here, readiness dissolves without becoming withdrawal. The mind does not prepare for anything. This lowering does not lead toward sleep. It does not signal calm. It does not bring relief. It simply reduces the effort of holding awareness in place. In this reduced effort, nothing new emerges. The faint inner movement brushes against awareness once more, then remains where it was. It does not try to enter. It does not ask to be met. Awareness does not feel compelled to meet it. There is a quiet neutrality in this, not disinterest, not detachment, simply the absence of requirement. The internal voice remains silent. There is no commentary on what is happening, no sense that something should be happening instead. Awareness remains lowered without direction. The faintness at the edge does not change. It does not fade because awareness lowered. It does not intensify either. It remains stable in its subtlety. This stability is not named. It does not become steadiness as a theme. Awareness notices that even the idea of noticing begins to thin. Presence becomes less reflective. There is less sense of I am aware. There is simply awareness occurring. This does not feel dissolving. It feels unweighted. The internal space does not move toward conclusion. It does not frame this state as something achieved. It does not prepare to leave it. The faint inner movement no longer registers as something separate. It blends into the general texture of inner life without becoming indistinct. It simply loses its status as an object. Awareness does not mark this blending. It does not notice the transition as a change. There is no sense of something ending. The lowering continues, but not progressively. It settles into a level that does not shift further. In this level, there is no pressure to evaluate what is present, no impulse to categorize, no tendency to decide whether something matters. Awareness becomes less invested in distinction. The faintness that once hovered at the edge is no longer tracked, not because it disappeared, but because awareness is no longer oriented toward edges or centers. Everything exists in the same plane. This plane does not feel flat. It feels even. There is no emphasis, no contrast. Inner life moves quietly, without standing out against itself. Awareness remains available without being alert. The mind does not reflect on this change. It does not think about how it feels. It does not compare it to other states. It simply remains. There is no sense of grounding, no sense of anchoring. The internal space does not settle into anything recognizable. It stays open, unstructured, unmarked. The faint inner movement has no place to stand out here. It does not become clearer. It does not become less. It becomes irrelevant without being dismissed. Awareness does not mind. The absence of effort does not feel like letting go. It feels like not holding. There is no tension around this, no sense that something is slipping away. Nothing was held to begin with. The internal space remains low, wide, unpressured. Nothing resolves. Nothing arrives. Awareness does not expect anything to follow. The lowered state remains without intention, without destination. There is no closing movement, no sense of completion. The internal space does not prepare for transition. It simply continues in this reduced effort presence. The faintness that once occupied attention no longer needs to be referenced. It has not gone anywhere. It simply no longer matters whether it is there. Awareness remains without center, without edge. This state does not claim permanence. It does not suggest that it will last. It simply exists while it exists. There's no conclusion drawn from this, no lesson extracted. The internal space remains quiet, even unengaged with outcome. Awareness stays lowered, not toward sleep, not toward rest, just lowered. And nothing else needs to happen. There is a subtle grounding that does not announce itself, not an arrival, not a settling into place. It happens quietly, without marking a point of change. Awareness does not recognize it as something new. It recognizes it only as the absence of drift. Nothing gathers here. Nothing tightens. The internal space does not become firm or structured. And yet there is a sense of being held without anything holding. Awareness stays with this condition without naming it. The feeling that was present earlier, small, unfelt, unclaimed, is not revisited. It does not return for recognition. It does not seek contact now. It remains as it was something that passed without entry. Awareness does not turn back toward it. There's a quiet understanding that what matters here is not time, not delay, not sequence. The idea that something arrived late loses relevance. What becomes visible instead is the role of entry, whether awareness was available when something occurred. That availability is not something awareness controls. It is not a skill. It is not a posture. It is simply a condition that exists or does not. Awareness rests with that without trying to influence it. There is no attempt to interpret the past, no sense of having missed an opportunity. The unfelt remains unfelt, and that fact does not feel unfinished. Grounding here does not imply closure. It does not suggest completion. It is simply the sense that awareness no longer moves in response to what did not happen. The internal space feels quieter, but not calm. Less mobile, but not fixed. It does not move toward explanation. It does not drift into reflection. It simply remains. Awareness notices how easily it could have turned this into steadiness, as if the absence of movement needed to become a state. That framing does not occur. The absence of movement remains incidental, not thematic. The small feeling from earlier does not gain new meaning here. It does not become something understood in hindsight. Awareness does not retroactively grant it significance. It remains exactly what it was, an inner movement that did not meet awareness. This does not feel dismissive. It feels accurate. There's a quiet easing in not needing to resolve anything, not needing to summarize what was felt or unfelt. Awareness does not need to account for its own limits. The idea of grounding often implies anchoring to something solid. Here, there is no anchor. The grounding occurs without reference. It is more like the absence of floating than the presence of weight. Awareness stays with that absence without interpreting it. The internal space does not lean forward. It does not lean back. It does not seek balance. It simply exists without directional pull. There's a faint sense of here that does not contrast with there. It does not mark a location. It marks only presence without movement. Awareness does not try to hold this. It does not attempt to maintain it. There is no fear of losing it. The unfelt remains unfelt. The uncontacted remains uncontacted. And awareness does not see this as a problem to be solved. There is a subtle confidence here, not as assurance, not as belief. More like the absence of tension around what cannot be changed. Awareness does not need to adjust itself in response to what did not enter. The internal space feels slightly firmer, not in substance, but in consistency. Nothing pulls awareness outward. Nothing calls it back. There's no sense of arrival, no sense of departure. Awareness remains available without being alert. It does not scan. It does not anticipate. It does not wait. The idea of completion does not arise. The experience does not suggest an ending. It does not feel like something has been integrated. It feels like something has been left alone. Awareness notices how often it seeks meaning in sequence. Something happened. Something followed. Something resolved. Here, sequence dissolves. What happened remains what happened, or what did not happen remains what did not. There is no effort to connect these. The internal space becomes tolerant of that disconnection. The small feeling that never entered awareness does not haunt this space. It does not linger as absence. It does not register as loss. It simply does not appear. And awareness does not attempt to summon it. There is a gentle neutrality in this, not indifference, not detachment. Just the absence of urgency. Awareness does not hurry to conclude. It does not linger to extract something. It remains. This grounding does not produce insight. It does not produce understanding. It produces stillness without claiming it. Awareness recognizes that this stillness does not need to be maintained. It is not something to hold on to. It exists while it exists and does not ask to continue. The internal space does not prepare for change. It does not brace. It does not relax further. It stays open, unmarked, unconcerned with what comes next. The unfelt from earlier remains part of experience only in the sense that it occurred without awareness. That fact does not weigh on the present. Awareness does not try to carry it forward. There is a subtle letting be here, not of something present, but of something absent. Awareness allows absence to remain absence without turning it into meaning. This does not feel like acceptance. It feels like neutrality. The internal space does not conclude anything about itself. It does not reflect on how it arrived here. It does not anticipate leaving. It simply remains grounded without anchor. Nothing tightens. Nothing resolves. The experience does not complete. It does not close. It does not finalize. Awareness stays with this open condition without defining it as an ending. The unfelt remains unfelt. The unentered remains unentered. And awareness does not require anything more from this. The internal space remains quiet, low pressure, free of interpretation. There is no takeaway, no conclusion. Just the continued presence of awareness, grounded without reference, allowing what did not happen to remain undone. There is a slight clarity that appears without explanation, not understanding, not realization. It does not arrive as a conclusion or an answer. It does not organize what came before. It simply becomes noticeable as a soft alignment inside, subtle enough to be overlooked if one were searching for something larger. Awareness meets this clarity without naming it as such. It does not frame it as insight. It does not try to translate it into meaning. The clarity does not ask to be translated. It has shape without definition. This shape does not point outward. It does not connect dots. It does not resolve anything that was left open. It exists as a quiet coherence that does not require interpretation. Awareness remains with this coherence gently. There is no sense that something has been figured out. There is no internal voice explaining what this clarity consists of. It is simply present. The unfelt from earlier does not change under this clarity. It does not become understandable in hindsight. It does not gain context. Awareness does not retroactively assign it a role. The clarity does not reorganize the past. It does not justify what happened. It does not explain what did not happen. It remains local. There is a quiet recognition that clarity does not always come with language, that something can feel aligned without being expressible. This recognition does not sharpen into a thought. It remains as a felt condition. Awareness notices how easily it could have tried to explain this, how quickly it might have said, "This means." That impulse does not complete. It dissolves before it forms a sentence. The clarity remains unspoken. It does not feel important. It does not feel trivial. It feels sufficient. Awareness does not lean into it. It does not try to hold on to it. There is no attempt to stabilize it or make it last. The clarity does not ask to be preserved. It exists quietly, without insistence. There is a subtle sense of coherence between awareness and what is present. Not harmony, not balance, just the absence of friction. Awareness is not pushing against anything. Nothing is pushing back. This absence of friction does not become a theme. It does not register as relief. It is simply noticed in passing. The internal space feels slightly more ordered, not because something was arranged, but because nothing is out of place. Awareness does not try to locate what is in place. It does not scan. It simply remains. The clarity does not deepen. It does not broaden. It does not evolve. It stays exactly as it is. Awareness notices that it can be with this clarity without changing posture. There is no need to sit up internally, no need to attend more closely. The clarity does not require engagement. The unfelt remains unfelt. The unentered remains unentered. And this clarity does not change that. There is a quiet permission here, not named, not emphasized. Permission for things to remain as they are, without needing to be explained or resolved. Awareness does not label this as permission. It simply behaves as if permission exists. The internal voice remains minimal. It does not narrate what is happening. It does not comment on the presence of clarity. It does not frame it as progress. Awareness senses that this clarity would dissolve if examined too closely. That to ask it what it means would be to lose it. And so awareness remains relaxed, allowing the clarity to remain unexamined. This does not feel like restraint. It feels like alignment. The clarity does not create expectation. It does not suggest that something will follow. It does not open a path forward. It simply exists. Awareness remains grounded without anchor as before. The clarity does not change that grounding. It fits within it without altering it. There is a faint sense of coherence between what is present now and what was noticed earlier, not as connection, but as compatibility. Nothing contradicts. Nothing requires adjustment. This coherence does not ask to be articulated. Awareness notices that it can remain here without seeking anything else. There is no hunger for more clarity, no desire to extend this state. The clarity is enough in its smallness. It does not demand belief. It does not claim truth. It remains experiential. The internal space does not become brighter. It does not become lighter. It remains dim, even low contrast. The clarity does not stand out against this background. It blends into it without disappearing. Awareness does not mark when the clarity begins to soften. It does not notice when it becomes less distinct. There is no sense of losing something. The clarity does not fade dramatically. It simply becomes less noticeable as awareness remains unconcerned with tracking it. Awareness stays present without holding on to any particular quality. There is no sense of completion here, no sense that something has been understood. The clarity does not close anything. It does not finalize. It simply passes through awareness as quietly as it arrived. The unfelt remains unfelt, untouched by this clarity. The earlier absence remains absence. Awareness does not reinterpret it. There is a subtle trust here, not trust in clarity, not trust in understanding. Trust in the ability of awareness to remain with what appears without needing to turn it into something else. This trust is not stated. It is implied through non-action. Awareness does not try to remember this clarity later. It does not store it. It does not treat it as something to return to. It remains present only while it is present. The internal space remains open, unpressured, uninterested in drawing conclusions. Nothing resolves. Nothing concludes. The clarity does not become a takeaway. It does not become a lesson. It does not transform into meaning. It remains what it was, a brief, soft alignment that appeared without explanation and left without announcement. Awareness remains where it is grounded, without anchor, receptive, without expectation. The experience does not close. It continues without direction. And awareness stays with that continuation without naming it as such. The arc narrows without closing, not tightening, not resolving. It is a gentle drawing in of attention that does not arrive at a point. Awareness does not feel compelled to gather what has been noticed into anything coherent. It simply becomes less expansive, less inclined to move outward without turning inward either. Nothing asks to be finished here. The faint presence that appeared earlier does not return as something clearer. It does not step forward for recognition. It does not announce that it is still here. And yet, there is a subtle familiarity in the internal space, as if awareness recognizes a pattern without needing to see it. This familiarity does not bring comfort. It does not bring relief. It brings quiet tolerance. Awareness notices how easily it might have tried to interpret this narrowing as an ending. That impulse does not complete. The narrowing does not behave like a conclusion. It does not signal that something is done. It simply reduces the range of movement. The unfelt remains unfelt. The unentered remains unentered. They do not press for acknowledgement now. They do not appear as absence or loss. They simply do not appear. Awareness does not summon them. There is a soft sense of contact here, not with a feeling, not with a thought, but with the condition of awareness itself. Awareness notices its own reduced movement without reflecting on why. This does not feel introspective. It feels structural. The internal space grows quieter, but not emptier. The quiet does not suggest calm. It suggests a lack of need to continue exploring, not because everything has been explored, but because exploration is no longer active. Awareness does not decide to stop. It simply does not continue. The faint inner traces that once hovered at the edge do not demand tracking now. They are allowed to remain diffuse. Awareness does not feel drawn to them, nor does it avoid them. They remain part of the internal field without being referenced. There is a sense of enough here, not as satisfaction, not as completion. More like the absence of push. Awareness does not feel propelled forward by curiosity or pulled backward by unresolvedness. It rests in the middle without naming that rest. The emotional trace that was once present becomes softer, not fading, not resolving. It simply loses definition. It is no longer something awareness distinguishes from the rest of inner life. This loss of distinction does not feel like disappearance. It feels like blending. Awareness does not mark this blending as an event. It does not note when it occurs. There's no moment to point to. The internal space remains low contrast. Differences between what is present and what is absent become less relevant. Awareness does not orient itself around either. There is no sense of finality, no sense of return. The mind does not ask what comes next. That question does not arise. Awareness does not wait for anything to follow. This is not an ending posture. It is a non-progressing one. Awareness notices how often it expects arcs to close, themes to resolve, states to shift. Here, none of that happens. The arc narrows, but it does not collapse into a point. It remains open-ended by nature. The unfelt does not transform into understanding. It does not become something recognized at last. It remains unfelt without tension. Awareness does not treat this as loss. It treats it as condition. There is a quiet acceptance here, not acceptance of content, but acceptance of structure. The structure of awareness does not require that everything be processed. Some things pass through without being met. Some traces remain without definition. Some arcs narrow without closing. Awareness allows this without commentary. The internal space does not shift into reflection. It does not review what has happened. It does not evaluate progress. It does not look back. It simply remains present with reduced movement. The faint sense of familiarity continues, but it does not deepen. It does not grow into recognition. It stays as a background awareness that nothing here is foreign. This familiarity does not comfort. It does not reassure. It simply removes the need to orient. Awareness becomes less concerned with distinction. It does not separate what was noticed from what was not. It does not hold on to earlier states. Everything settles into a similar level of relevance, not equal, but unprioritized. There is no sense that something is ending. There is no sense that something should begin. The internal space feels complete in its incompleteness. Awareness does not label this completeness. It does not declare it. It simply stops expecting more. The faint emotional traces that once appeared do not leave behind longing. They do not generate unfinishedness. They remain part of experience only in the sense that they once occurred. Now they do not need to be referenced. Awareness does not anticipate Part 18. It does not prepare for conclusion. It remains exactly where it is. The narrowing continues without reaching a limit. It does not compress into stillness. It does not open again. It simply holds at this reduced range. There's a quiet steadiness here that does not become a theme. Awareness does not notice it as steadiness. It notices only that nothing is moving it. This lack of movement does not feel fixed. It feels provisional. Awareness does not cling to it. The experience remains partial and acceptable. Nothing about it asks to be finished. Nothing about it suggests that something is missing. The internal space remains open enough to continue, but unconcerned with doing so. There is no emotional closure, no cognitive closure. The arc remains open. Awareness stays with that openness without naming it. It does not attempt to frame it as continuation or ending. It simply allows the narrowing to exist without resolution. Nothing is decided here. Nothing is concluded. The internal space remains low-pressure, quiet, uninterested in final statements. The unfelt remains unfelt. The trace remains trace. And awareness remains present without needing anything else to happen. There is no moment of arrival here, no sense of having reached something. Awareness settles into a condition where nothing needs to be concluded. Not because everything has been covered, and not because there is nothing left. Simply because the need to move toward an ending has loosened. The internal space remains open, but not expectant. Small feelings, those that never found time earlier, do not return now as content. They do not surface to be acknowledged. They do not appear as reminders. They remain what they were, movements that pass through without becoming events. Awareness does not look for them. There is a quiet recognition that this space is not meant to resolve anything. It is not designed to clarify. It does not aim to gather threads or summarize what has been noticed. It simply remains available. Availability here does not mean readiness. It does not imply that something is about to happen. It means only that nothing is being blocked and nothing is being invited. Awareness rests in that neutrality without needing to name it. The internal field feels gently continuous, not flowing forward, not looping back. There is no sense of progression. There is only the persistence of presence without direction. This persistence does not demand attention. It does not require maintenance. It exists as a background condition rather than a focal state. The faint traces that once hovered at the edge are no longer distinguishable from the rest of inner life. Not because they disappeared, but because awareness is no longer oriented toward edges. The idea of center and periphery has lost relevance. Everything occupies the same quiet plane. Awareness does not register this as flattening or dullness. It registers it as evenness. There are no peaks to attend to and no gaps to fill. Nothing stands out. Nothing asks to be noticed. This does not feel empty. It feels unmarked. The mind does not attempt to interpret this unmarked quality. It does not label it as peace or calm. It does not frame it as rest. Those words would add shape where none is needed. Awareness notices that it can remain here without effort. There is no holding required. Nothing slips if it is not held. Nothing appears if it is not sought. This condition does not promise continuity. It does not suggest permanence. It exists without implying that it should continue. Awareness does not cling to it. The unfelt remains unfelt without tension. There is no sense that something was denied or missed. It simply did not become part of experience, and that fact does not press against the present. Absence remains absence without becoming a theme. Awareness remains unconcerned with whether something should have been different. There is no comparison to an alternative state, no imagined version of how things might have unfolded. The internal space does not measure itself. There is a subtle ease in this, not relief, not comfort, more like the absence of insistence. Awareness is not insisting that something be understood or completed. The small feelings that once lacked time are not revisited. They are not given space now to compensate. Awareness does not feel obligated to meet them belatedly. They remain part of the broader movement of inner life without being singled out. The experience does not offer a takeaway. It does not suggest a lesson. It does not point toward a practice or a change. It remains self-contained. Awareness does not narrate what is happening. The internal voice stays quiet, not because it is suppressed, but because there is nothing it needs to say. The mind does not mark this as the end. It does not prepare to leave. There is no transition gesture, no closing movement. The internal space remains as it is without indicating that something is concluding. The earlier narrowing of the arc remains open-ended. It does not resolve into stillness or activity. It simply stays narrow without closing. This openness without direction feels stable but not fixed. Awareness does not rely on it. It does not treat it as a baseline to return to. It is simply what is present now. The absence of closure does not feel unfinished. It feels appropriate to the nature of what has been noticed. Small feelings that never became events do not require endings. They do not demand recognition or understanding. They pass, and awareness remains. There is a quiet acknowledgement here, not stated, not emphasized, that inner life does not always organize itself into meaningful units. Some movements occur without ever forming a shape that can be held. This acknowledgement does not become insight. It remains a gentle background, understanding that does not ask to be retained. Awareness stays with the continuity of experience without assigning structure to it. The internal space does not brighten or dim further. It remains low contrast, evenly distributed. Nothing calls for attention. There is no anticipation of what comes next. Awareness does not wait for another state to appear. It does not scan for change. It simply remains present without expectation. The unfelt remains unfelt. The unentered remains unentered. And awareness does not require anything else. There is a subtle sense of completion without closure, not because something ended, but because nothing needs to continue. The experience feels whole without being resolved. Awareness does not label this wholeness. It does not claim it. It simply rests in it. No summary arises. No conclusion forms. The internal space remains open, neutral, uninterested in final statements. This is not an ending in the usual sense. It is a stopping of movement without a stopping point. Awareness stays where it is without needing to go anywhere else. Nothing is asked of the moment. Nothing is taken from it. The space remains quiet, available, unpressured, allowing what was small to remain small, what was unfelt to remain unfelt, and what never formed to remain unformed. And awareness continues without naming that continuation.